Mrs. John F. Kennedy greets reporters in the office of her brother-in-law, the Attorney General. The former First Lady expresses thanks for herself and her two children for the nearly 800,000 messages received since...
When Lee Radziwill heard that her sister Jackie was going to marry Aristotle Onassis, she picked up the phone and screamed at Truman Capote. How could she do this to me? Not how could he, how could she? Because Lee had loved Onassis first. Lee had been the one on his yacht, at his parties, in his bed. Lee had been the one who told her friends, openly, "Ari is what I deserve." Lee had been the one who had turned down a marriage proposal from the richest man in the Mediterranean because marrying a man the Kennedys considered disreputable would have humiliated her sister in the White House. Lee had sacrificed Onassis for Jackie's sake. And then Jackie married him anyway. That is the betrayal at the center of this story, and it is only the beginning of it, because the Bouvier sisters had been competing over the same men for their entire lives, and by 1968 the competition had consumed both of them. Here is what almost nobody outside the family knew at the time. Lee Radziwill did not just love Onassis before Jackie did. She introduced them. After JFK's assassination in November of 1963, when Jackie was suicidal with grief, flushing pills down the toilet, unable to function, it was Lee who brought her onto Onassis's yacht, into his world, into his protection, because Lee believed, genuinely, that Onassis was the only man alive with the money and the power and the security apparatus to keep her shattered sister and her sister's children safe. She gave her lover to her sister to save her life, and 5 years later her sister married him. But the betrayal ran in both directions, because there is a second layer to this story that makes the first one look almost quaint. Multiple biographers, including J. Randy Taraborelli, have documented what the Kennedy inner circle knew and the public never learned, that Lee Radziwill had an affair with John F. Kennedy himself, Jackie's husband, the President of the United States, Lee's own brother-in-law, two sisters, the same two men, JFK and Onassis. Each sister sleeping with the other's partner across a decade in a rivalry so deep and so tangled that when Jackie died in 1994, she left Lee nothing in her will, not a dollar, not a photograph, nothing but a single line of devastating courtesy. "I have made no provision in this my will for my sister, Lee B. Radziwill, for whom I have great affection, because I have already done so during my lifetime." That line, written in a dead woman's hand, is the last word in a sisterhood that spanned 60 years and never recovered from the men they shared. This is the story of Jackie Kennedy, Lee Radziwill, and the man between them, the shipping magnate who chose Jackie and destroyed them both, the sister who loved him first and lost him, the sister who married him and buried him, and the rivalry that started in a Park Avenue nursery and ended with a will that said, in the politest possible language, "You are dead to me." If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Bouvier sisters were built to compete, because their mother made sure of it. Janet Lee Bouvier was a New York socialite who had married above her station and spent the rest of her life making sure her daughters married above theirs. She was the daughter of an Irish-American real estate developer named James T. Lee, a self-made man whose money was new enough that old money New York looked at the family sideways. Janet had clawed her way into the social register by marrying John Vernu Bouvier III, known to everyone as Black Jack, a stockbroker from one of the oldest French Catholic families in the city, devastatingly handsome, charming, and constitutionally incapable of fidelity. Jacqueline Lee Bouvier was born on July 28, 1929. Her sister, Caroline Lee Bouvier, arrived on March 3, 1933, 3.5 years later. They grew up in a Park Avenue apartment and a country estate in East Hampton, surrounded by money and horses and the particular atmosphere of a family that looked immaculate from the outside and was falling apart from within. Black Jack was a drunk and a cheat, flagrantly, in the way that handsome men of that era cheated, with a confidence that assumed his wife would simply absorb it. Janet absorbed it for years and then stopped absorbing it. The divorce in 1940 was bitter and public and humiliating, and it taught both girls, before either of them was 12, the central lesson their mother wanted them to learn: that men could not be trusted, that security came from marrying well, and that marrying well meant marrying money and power, because love was something that left you on Park Avenue with 2 daughters and a legal bill. Janet remarried in 1942 to Hugh D. Auchincloss, a wealthy heir with connections to Standard Oil and a sprawling estate in Virginia called Merrywood. The girls grew up between Merrywood and Hammersmith Farm in Newport, Rhode Island, in an atmosphere of old money respectability that was, in reality, their stepfather's money and their mother's ambition. Janet drilled them. She corrected their posture. She monitored their friends. She assessed their marriage prospects with the cold eye of a woman who had been burned once and was not going to let her daughters make the same mistake. The dynamic between the sisters was set early, and Janet reinforced it constantly. Jackie was the intellectual. She was curious, bookish, fluent in French, interested in art and literature and the world of ideas. She was not, by the beauty standards of that era, the prettier sister. She had a wide-set face, a strong jaw, and a quiet intensity that read as intelligence rather than glamour. Lee was the beauty. She was delicate, fine-featured, effortlessly stylish, in a way that drew attention without effort. She was lighter than Jackie, funnier in social settings, more naturally charming in the way that second daughters often are, having learned early that the eldest had already claimed the territory of seriousness. She was also, from childhood onward, the one who felt she was losing. Because Jackie was first. First born, first educated, first married, first to matter. The dynamic of the Bouvier family was that Jackie set the standard, and Lee chased it, and Janet, whether she intended to or not, reinforced the hierarchy by treating Jackie's achievements as the benchmark against which Lee's life would be measured. Both girls were trained, explicitly, to marry well. Both girls understood, by their late teens, that marriage was not a romantic endeavor, but a strategic one, and that their mother's approval depended on the quality of the man they secured. The competition was not subtle. It was the organizing principle of their young lives. Jackie moved first. In 1953, at 24, she married John Fitzgerald Kennedy, a young United States senator from Massachusetts with presidential ambitions and a family fortune built by his father Joe Kennedy through a combination of liquor, real estate, and political maneuvering. It was, by Janet Bouvier Auchincloss's standards, the perfect marriage. Jackie had married money, power, and trajectory, all at once. Lee, 3.5 years younger, watched her sister marry a future president and understood, with the clarity of a younger sibling who has spent her whole life in second place, that she had just been permanently outranked. It did not matter what she did next. It did not matter whom she married. Jackie was going to be the wife of a senator, then the wife of a president, then the most famous woman in the world, and Lee was going to be her sister. She married Michael Canfield in 1953, the same year Jackie married Kennedy. It did not last. She married Prince Stanislaw Radziwill in 1959, which gave her a title and a London life and a certain European glamour. She called herself Princess Radziwill. It was a real title, technically, though Stas had renounced it for British citizenship. It was also, in the unspoken arithmetic of the Bouvier sisters, not enough. A Polish prince was not a United States president. Lee knew it. Jackie knew it. Their mother knew it. By the early 1960s, Jackie was in the White House and Lee was in London, and the gap between them had become a permanent feature of both their lives. And then Lee met a Greek shipping magnate with more money than the Kennedys, more power than a prince, and a private island in the Ionian Sea. His name was Aristotle Onassis, and for the first time in her life, Lee Radziwill believed she had found the one thing that could close the gap between herself and her sister. Aristotle Onassis was not a handsome man, and he did not need to be. He was short, dark, thick-featured, with heavy glasses, and a face that would not have gotten him past the door of a Hollywood casting office. What he had instead was money on a scale that made beauty irrelevant. He was a Greek shipping magnate who had built a fleet of tankers and cargo vessels into one of the largest private fortunes on Earth. He owned Olympic Airways, the Greek national airline. He owned the island of Scorpios in the Ionian Sea outright. He owned the Christina, a yacht that had once been a Canadian destroyer and that he had converted into one of the most extravagant private vessels afloat, with gold-plated bathroom fixtures and bar stools upholstered in the skin of whale foreskins, a detail so grotesque that it became, perversely, a talking point at his parties. He was also, when Lee Radziwill met him in the early 1960s, in the middle of a long, public, passionate affair with Maria Callas, the greatest opera singer of the 20th century. Callas had left her husband for Onassis. She had given up a portion of her career for him. She loved him with a consuming intensity that everyone in their world could see. And Onassis loved her back, in his way, which was the way of a man who loved several women simultaneously and did not consider this a contradiction. Lee met him through the social circuit that connected European aristocracy, American money, and Mediterranean excess. By 1962, while Jackie was in the White House hosting state dinners, and Lee was in London in a marriage to Prince Radziwill that was slowly dying of boredom and mutual disappointment, Lee and Onassis began an affair. It was not subtle. They were seen together at the Athens Hilton opening in August of 1963. They were seen on the Christina. They were seen at parties across the Mediterranean. Lee was, by her own later account to friends, deeply in love with him, in the way that a woman who has spent her entire life in her sister's shadow falls in love with the one man whose wealth and power could, for the first time, make her the more important Bouvier sister. "Ari is what I deserve," she told friends. She meant it. After a lifetime of being second, of watching Jackie marry a president while she married a prince nobody outside of London society had heard of, Lee believed she had finally found the man who could rebalance the equation. Onassis was richer than the Kennedys. His world was grander than the White House, and he wanted her. The Kennedys did not approve. Both John and Robert Kennedy considered Onassis disreputable, a man the US government had sued in 1955 for removing a fleet of ships he had purchased and promised to keep in the country. Robert Kennedy, serving as Attorney General, regarded Lee's relationship with Onassis as a betrayal of the whole family, not because of any moral objection to adultery, which would have been rich coming from the Kennedy family, but because Onassis was a political liability. An in-law connected to a man the Justice Department had prosecuted would be a problem for the administration. To keep Lee away from Onassis, the Kennedys asked her to accompany JFK on a presidential European tour in the summer of 1963. Lee went. Jackie, 7 months pregnant and having already suffered one miscarriage, stayed behind. Lee traveled with the president through Britain, Ireland, Italy, and Germany, and the photographs from that trip show a beautiful young woman beside the most powerful man in the world, smiling, at ease, closer to the center of power than she had ever been. Whether the relationship between Lee and JFK crossed the line from flirtation into affair has been debated by biographers for decades. Multiple sources, including J. Randy Taraborelli in Jackie, Janet, and Lee, have documented what the Kennedy inner circle knew, that Lee and JFK had a physical relationship. The timing, the extent, and the seriousness of it remain disputed. What is not disputed is that Jackie eventually learned about it, and that it became another stone in the wall that was slowly building between the two sisters. Then, on August 7, 1963, Jackie lost her baby. Patrick Bouvier Kennedy was born prematurely and died 39 hours later. Jackie was devastated, trapped in the White House, depressed, feeling unsupported by a husband whose infidelities she had endured for a decade. Lee did something that she believed, at the time, was an act of love. She arranged for her grieving sister to come aboard the Christina, Onassis's yacht, for a cruise through the Greek islands. She was giving Jackie her world, She was sharing the man she loved. She was also, without knowing it, handing him to her. Onassis met Jackie Kennedy on that cruise and was immediately, totally captivated. Jackie later said, looking at the yacht and the island and the scale of the life Onassis had built. So this is how kings live. Onassis, watching the most famous woman in the world walk across his deck, understood that Lee Radziwill, however charming, however beautiful, was not the Bouvier sister who could make him what he wanted to be. He wanted Jackie, and from that cruise forward he began to pursue her. 10 weeks later, on November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, and everything that followed, every decision, every marriage, every betrayal, flowed from that single afternoon in Texas. Lee Radziwill was in London when the call came from Dallas. She flew to Washington immediately. She was at Jackie's side within hours, and she stayed there for the next several weeks, through the funeral, through the impossible days in the White House, through the packing and the moving, and the slow, terrible business of helping a widow with 2 small children relocate out of the most famous house in the world. Whatever else was true about the Bouvier sisters, whatever competition and jealousy and betrayal ran underneath their relationship, Lee showed up in November of 1963 the way a sister is supposed to show up. She held Jackie upright. She managed logistics. She flushed pills down the toilet when she found them, because Jackie was, by multiple accounts, suicidal with grief in those first weeks, and Lee understood that the medications in the house were a danger to a woman in that state. And then Lee made the decision that would define the rest of both their lives. She gave Jackie to Onassis. The reasoning, as she later explained it to Taraborelli and to others, was genuine and selfless, at least in the moment it was made. Jackie needed protection, not emotional protection, which Lee could provide. Physical protection, security, the kind of impenetrable wall of money and power and private islands and armed staff that could keep a former First Lady and her 2 children safe from the threats that were already arriving in the mail. The Secret Service detail would eventually be reduced. The government's obligation to protect her would fade. And in 1963 and 1964, in the immediate aftermath of a presidential assassination, the fear that Jackie and the children might be targets was real and constant. Onassis could provide what no one else could. He had the yacht. He had the island. He had the money to hire as much private security as any head of state. He had, in the plainest terms, a world that was physically unreachable to anyone he did not want to reach it. Lee made the introduction, or rather, she deepened a connection that the cruise aboard the Christina had already started. She stepped aside. She let Onassis become Jackie's protector. She did it, she said later, because she could not have lived with herself if something had happened to Jackie and the children, because she had not allowed Onassis to do what he was uniquely positioned to do. She gave up the man she loved to save her sister. That sacrifice would have been the noblest act in the entire Bouvier story if it had stayed a sacrifice. But it did not stay. Because Onassis, once given access to Jackie Kennedy, did not remain a protector. He became a suitor, and Jackie, for her own complicated reasons, some of which were about safety, and some of which were about money, and some of which were, on some level, about the same competition with Lee that had been running since their mother first compared them in the Park Avenue nursery, began to respond. For the next 5 years, from 1963 to 1968, Onassis moved between 3 women. He continued his affair with Maria Callas. He maintained whatever remained of his connection to Lee, and he pursued Jackie with the patient, strategic persistence of a man who had built a shipping empire by understanding that the most valuable acquisitions take time. Lee knew. She knew because Onassis told her, or because the Mediterranean gossip circuit told her, or because she simply understood, as a woman who had watched her sister outrank her at every stage of life, that it was happening again. She told friends she had turned down Onassis's proposal because marrying him would have embarrassed Jackie in the White House. Now the White House was gone, Jackie was a widow, and the proposal Lee had refused was being redirected at her sister. In the spring of 1968, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Jackie, who had barely survived the first assassination, was shattered again. The last remaining protection the Kennedy family offered had been violently removed. She told friends, convinced that the Kennedys were being hunted and that her children would be next. She called Onassis. Within months, the wedding was arranged. And Lee Radziwill, who had loved him first, who had given him up to save her sister, was invited to watch. The wedding took place on October 20th, 1968, on Scorpios, Onassis's private island in the Ionian Sea. Jackie wore a long-sleeved Valentino dress. She was 39 years old. Onassis was 62. It was raining. The ceremony was Greek Orthodox, small, conducted inside a tiny chapel on the island, in front of roughly 24 guests. Caroline and John Jr., Jackie's children from the Kennedy marriage, were there. Lee Radziwill was there. Lee stood on the island that she had visited as Onassis's lover, watching her sister marry the man she had given up for her. She attended because not attending would have been a public rupture the family could not afford, and because the Bouvier sisters had been trained since childhood to present a united front regardless of what was happening underneath. She smiled for the photographs. She said, in her public statement, that she hoped the marriage would bring Jackie the happiness she deserved. Privately, she was devastated. Truman Capote, who was one of Lee's closest confidants during this period, reported the phone call in which she screamed at him, "How could she do this to me?" Capote, who was not a man who kept secrets when keeping them was less entertaining than telling them, repeated the story widely. It became part of the permanent record of the Bouvier sisters, the moment the competition between them broke into something that could not be repaired. The marriage Jackie entered that day on Scorpios was not, by any conventional measure, a love match. Jackie had negotiated a prenuptial agreement of enormous specificity before the wedding, demanding guaranteed annual payments, separate living arrangements, and financial provisions for her children. Onassis signed it. He signed it because he wanted Jackie Kennedy on his arm more than he wanted the money it cost him, and because owning the most famous widow in the world was, for a man who had spent his life collecting the most expensive version of everything, the ultimate acquisition. Jackie moved into the world Onassis had built, the yacht, the island, the houses in Paris and Athens, and she discovered almost immediately what Lee could have told her if they had been speaking honestly, that Onassis was not a man who belonged to one woman. He had not stopped seeing Maria Callas. The affair with Callas, which had been running for over a decade, continued through the marriage to Jackie, openly enough that the Greek and European press reported on it constantly. Onassis would dine with Callas in Paris, while Jackie was on Scorpios. He would visit Callas's apartment and stay for hours. He made almost no effort to hide it. Jackie handled it the way she had handled JFK's affairs, which was to absorb it, privately, without public complaint, because public complaint would have destroyed the image and the arrangement, and Jackie Kennedy Onassis was a woman who understood, better than almost anyone alive, the difference between a private reality and a public narrative. She had learned that lesson in the White House, watching her husband sleep with other women, while she smiled for the cameras, and she applied it again on Scorpios. But the marriage deteriorated anyway, not from the infidelity alone, but from the fundamental mismatch at its core. Jackie was a woman of culture, of books, of quiet elegance. Onassis was a man of excess, of deal-making, of loud restaurants and louder friends, and the particular Greek masculine energy that filled every room he entered. They did not speak the same language, figuratively, or sometimes literally. She was isolated on the island. She was bored in Athens. She spent his money freely, which he had expected and then resented, because Onassis, for all his wealth, kept careful track of what things cost, and Jackie's spending habits appalled him. By the early 1970s, the marriage was a transaction both parties were enduring rather than enjoying. Jackie spent more time in New York. Onassis spent more time with Callas. The prenuptial agreement, which had seemed like Jackie's insurance policy, became the terms of a cold arrangement between two people who had married, for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with power, security, and the specific needs each of them had brought to the altar. And then, in January of 1973, something happened that changed Onassis forever, and that made everything else, the marriage, the affairs, the money, suddenly irrelevant. His son Alexander, 24 years old, was killed in a plane crash at Athens airport. The death of Alexander Onassis broke his father in a way that nothing else in his life had broken him. Onassis had built his empire partly for his children, and Alexander had been his heir, the boy he was training to take over the fleet. The crash was caused by pilot error during takeoff, and Alexander died of brain injuries the following day. Onassis, by every account of the people around him, was never the same. He aged visibly, he stopped eating, he developed the illness, myasthenia gravis, an autoimmune disease that would kill him within 2 years. He died on March 15, 1975, in a Paris hospital, at 69 years old. Jackie was not at his bedside. Maria Callas was not at his bedside. His daughter Christina was. Lee Radziwill, who had loved him first, got nothing from the estate. Jackie, after a legal battle with Christina Onassis that lasted months, accepted a settlement of roughly $26 million and walked away from the Onassis name forever. 2 sisters had loved the same man. One had given him up. One had married him. Neither of them had gotten what they wanted from him. And the damage the triangle had done to their relationship was about to become permanent. After Onassis died, the 2 sisters had nothing left to fight over except each other. Jackie took the settlement money and returned to New York. She moved into a Fifth Avenue apartment. She took a job as a book editor, first at Viking Press and then at Doubleday, and she lived the last 2 decades of her life with a quiet dignity that was, after everything she had been through, her final and most convincing performance. She dated the diamond merchant Maurice Templesman, who became her companion for the rest of her life. She raised Caroline and John Jr. She edited books she cared about. She walked in Central Park. She became, in the last chapter of her public life, something the earlier chapters had never allowed her to be, which was private. Lee's path was harder, and it was harder for reasons that went beyond Onassis. She had spent her entire adult life defined by proximity to her sister, and now, with the Kennedy years over and the Onassis years over and the Radziwill marriage long since ended in divorce, Lee was left with the question she had been avoiding since childhood. Who was she when she was not Jackie's sister? She tried acting. Truman Capote, who was still her close friend, helped her get a role in a 1967 stage production of The Philadelphia Story in Chicago. The reviews were brutal. She tried interior design. She had genuine taste, real skill, a natural eye for beauty that friends and clients acknowledged. But the work never gained the kind of public traction that would have given her an identity independent of the Bouvier name. She tried writing. She published a memoir of photographs called Happy Times in 2001, which was slim and elegant and revealed almost nothing. She was, through all of it, struggling financially, in a way that the public did not fully understand. Lee Radziwill had lived her entire life among the extremely wealthy, without ever being extremely wealthy herself. Stas Radziwill had money, but not Onassis money. Her own earning capacity was limited, and Jackie, who could have set her up for life with a single check from the Onassis settlement, never did. Jackie lent Lee money. Jackie gave Lee money for specific things, but Jackie never made the grand, permanent gesture that would have given Lee financial independence, and the withholding of that gesture became, according to Tara Borelli and others who knew them, one of the deepest unspoken wounds in a relationship already full of them. The sisters maintained contact through the 1970s and 1980s. They were seen together at family events. They spoke on the phone. They were, to the outside world, the Bouvier sisters, still connected, still bound by blood and history, and the shared experience of having lived through things no one else could fully understand. But the warmth that had once existed between them, the warmth that had sent Lee racing to Washington after Dallas, the warmth that had made Lee give up Onassis to protect her sister, had cooled into something more formal and more careful. They were sisters who had hurt each other too deeply to be friends and were too bound together to be strangers. Lee's son Anthony, whom she adored, was diagnosed with testicular cancer in the mid-1980s. He fought it for years. He married the television journalist Carol DeFalco in 1994, in a ceremony Jackie attended despite being, by then, seriously ill herself. It was one of the last times the sisters were photographed together. Jackie had been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in January of 1994. The cancer was aggressive. She underwent chemotherapy. By the spring, it was clear the treatment was not working. She went home to her Fifth Avenue apartment to die. Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis died on May 19, 1994. She was 64 years old. Maurice Templesman was at her bedside. Her children were there. Lee was there. And then the will was read. Jackie left her estate, valued at over $100 million, to her children, to Templesman, and to various trusts and charities. She left Lee's children, Anthony and Tina, $500,000 each. She left Lee herself nothing. The exact words, written in Jackie's hand and witnessed by her attorneys, were, "I have made no provision in this my will for my sister, Lee B. Radziwill, for whom I have great affection, because I have already done so during my lifetime." That sentence is, in 11 words, the final summary of a 60-year sisterhood. For whom I have great affection. It reads like a kiss on a cheek that has already been slapped. It is the most elegant way in the English language to say, you got what you were going to get, and this is not it. 5 years after Jackie died, Lee lost her son. Anthony Radziwill had been fighting cancer for over a decade. He had been diagnosed in the mid-1980s with testicular cancer, had gone through treatment, had gone into remission, and had relapsed. He had married Carol DeFalco in 1994, in the ceremony Jackie had attended in the final months of her own life. He had kept working as a television documentary producer, kept living, kept pushing through the treatment cycles with the particular stubbornness of a young man who had too much to lose. He died on August 10, 1999. He was 40 years old. Lee Radziwill buried her son and entered a decade of grief that those close to her said she never fully came out of. Anthony had been, by every account of the people who knew the family, the central love of Lee's life, the relationship that mattered more than any marriage, or any affair, or any sister. She had raised him, she had watched him fight, she had watched him die, and she was, at 66, a woman who had lost her lover to her sister, lost her sister to cancer, lost her son to cancer, and been left out of the will of the person she had spent her whole life chasing. She lived on. That is the blunt fact of it. She lived on in New York, in a small apartment that was elegant but modest by the standards of the world she had once moved through. She designed interiors. She attended events. She was, in the particular way of aging socialites, still beautiful and still present in the rooms that mattered. But the rooms were smaller now, and the people in them had changed, and Lee Radziwill, in her 70s and 80s, was a woman whose story most Americans under 40 did not know. She gave almost no interviews in her final years. She published nothing substantial after Happy Times. She did not write the memoir everyone expected her to write, the one that would have told her side of the Onassis triangle, the one that would have settled, for the record, exactly what had happened between her and JFK, exactly what she had felt watching Jackie marry the man she had loved first, exactly what the will had done to her. That book was worth millions. Publishers would have paid enormously for it. She never wrote it. Whether the silence was dignity or exhaustion, or simply the recognition that telling the truth would have cost her more than keeping it, nobody knows. She kept her own counsel. She kept whatever she carried about Jackie and about Onassis and about all of it locked inside, and she let the biographers and the journalists construct the story from the outside. What the biographers constructed, consistently, was a portrait of two sisters whose lives had been shaped by the same forces, the same ambitious mother, the same philandering father, the the same training in the art of marrying well, and who had arrived at completely different destinations. Jackie had married a president and a shipping magnate and died with over $100 million and a reputation as one of the most admired women of the 20th century. Lee had married a prince and loved a billionaire and ended up in a small New York apartment with no husband, no son, and no provision in her sister's will. The arithmetic looked simple from the outside. Jackie won, Lee lost. But the people who knew them both said it was never that simple, because winning, in the Bouvier family, had always been defined by Janet, and Janet's definition of winning was a thing that had damaged both her daughters equally, just in different ways. Jackie had won by the scoreboard and spent her whole life performing a serenity she did not always feel. Lee had lost by the scoreboard and spent her whole life knowing it. Neither of them had been free. Lee Radziwill died on February 15, 2019, in New York City. She was 85 years old. The obituaries called her a socialite, an interior designer, a style icon, and Jackie Kennedy's sister. That last phrase, Jackie Kennedy's sister, appeared in every single obituary, usually in the first line, because that was what the world had decided she was, and 60 years of trying to be something else had not changed it. She had been the beautiful one. She had been the one who loved Onassis first. She had given him up to save her sister, and her sister had taken him anyway, and neither the sacrifice nor the betrayal had ever been publicly acknowledged by either of them. Two sisters, raised to compete, who competed over the same men for 40 years, and who died 15 years apart, having never once, in any recorded conversation, spoken honestly about what they had done to each other. The title says, Onassis chose Jackie and destroyed them both. That is true, but it is not the whole truth, because the destruction started long before Onassis entered the picture, and it continued long after he left it. Aristotle Onassis was not the cause of what happened between Jackie and Lee. He was the accelerant. The fire had been burning since the Park Avenue nursery, since Janet Bouvier lined her two daughters up and taught them that their value was measured by the men they married. Onassis did not create the competition. He simply became the final, most consequential arena for it. The man both sisters wanted for different reasons. The man who chose the more famous sister because fame was what he was actually buying, and the man whose choice confirmed, permanently and publicly, the hierarchy Janet had established 30 years earlier. Jackie won Onassis. What she won was a 6-year marriage to a man who continued sleeping with Maria Callas, who resented her spending, who aged catastrophically after his son's death, and who died in a Paris hospital while she was in New York. She won $26 million in the settlement. She won the name Onassis, which she used for the rest of her life, appending it to Kennedy, as though both marriages were achievements to be displayed, rather than relationships to be remembered. Lee lost Onassis. What she lost was a man she had loved genuinely, or as genuinely as a woman raised by Janet Bouvier could love anything without calculating its strategic value. She lost him not because he stopped wanting her, but because her sister was a bigger prize, and Onassis was a man who always wanted the biggest version of everything. Lee's pain was real. Her scream to Capote was real. And the wound never healed, because the person who inflicted it was not a rival she could walk away from. It was her sister. You cannot divorce your sister. You cannot stop being related to the person who took the thing you loved most. You can only keep showing up at the same family events, smiling, for decades, while the wound sits between you like an uninvited guest at every table. Maria Callas, the third woman in the triangle that nobody counts because she was not a Bouvier, arguably lost the most. She had given up her marriage and a significant portion of her career for Onassis. She had loved him for over a decade. She had watched him marry Jackie and had continued seeing him anyway, because she could not stop, because the love was that deep and that destructive. When Onassis died in 1975, Callas was devastated. She died 2 years later, in September of 1977, alone in her Paris apartment, at 53. The cause was listed as a heart attack. She had been, for the last years of her life, reclusive, depressed, and unable to move past the man who had used her love as a convenience and married someone else. 3 women loved Aristotle Onassis. None of them got what they wanted from him. One got his money. One got his attention first and lost it. One got his love and watched him marry somebody else. He was, in the end, a man who collected extraordinary women, the way he collected ships and islands, as assets in a portfolio, and who was genuinely surprised when the assets turned out to have feelings. Look at the whole shape of it. 2 sisters raised in a Park Avenue apartment by a mother who taught them that their worth was measured in the men they secured. A president and a prince, an assassination and a sacrifice, a yacht and an island and a wedding in the rain. A will that left one sister nothing but a sentence of devastating courtesy. And underneath all of it, from the nursery to the grave, the same question neither of them ever answered honestly, to each other or to themselves. Did Jackie take Onassis from Lee, knowing what it would do? Or did Jackie, a widow with 2 children, in a country where Kennedys were being murdered, simply reach for the safest thing available and not care, in that moment, who it had belonged to first? Lee believed it was deliberate. Jackie never said. The conversation the 2 of them needed to have, the honest one, the one where Lee said you took him and Jackie said I know, never happened. Not once, in 60 years, did either Bouvier sister sit across from the other and tell the truth about what they had done. They were raised by a woman who taught them that appearance was everything and honesty was a liability. They learned the lesson perfectly. They performed sisterhood for 60 years without ever risking the one conversation that might have saved it. Lee Radziwill died in 2019, at 85, in a New York apartment, without a husband, without a son, without a sister, and without the conversation. Jackie Kennedy Onassis died in 1994, at 64, in a Fifth Avenue apartment, with $100 million, without a will provision for Lee, and without the conversation. Aristotle Onassis died in 1975, at 69, in a Paris hospital, without Jackie at his bedside, without Lee at his bedside, without Maria Callas at his bedside, alone with his daughter Christina, who would herself die at 37. He chose Jackie. It destroyed them both. But what destroyed the Bouvier sisters was not really a Greek shipping magnate with a whaleskin barstool and a private island. What destroyed them was a mother who taught them, before either of them was old enough to know better, that love was a competition and that the prize went to the sister who married best. Both of them married spectacularly. Neither of them won. And neither of them, in 60 years of shared history, ever found the courage to say so out loud. That is the real scandal. Not the yacht, not the island, not the affair or the wedding or the will. The scandal is the silence. 2 sisters who needed one honest conversation more than they needed any of the men they fought over, and who died, 15 years apart, without ever having it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.